Silence can rule a room in a way money never learns to. In the Sterling estate, it lived in the air like cold marble and furniture polish, heavy, gold-trimmed, and afraid of itself. Alistair Sterling, the man who carved an empire out of nothing, hadn't spoken a single word in 4 years. The staff wheeled him past, like an antique that might shatter if it was breathed on wrong. His own board circled that wheelchair like men, waiting politely for a will to finish writing itself. But the man kneeling on those marble floors wasn't one of them. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't family. He was a broke single father in a second-hand flannel, knees already dirty, working a job he only took for the paycheck, with his little girl's hand resting on his shoulder. And he was all out of patience. So he leaned in, looked the old man dead in the eye, and said one word, in a language no one in that gilded house ever expected to hear. A word thought dead for 4 years just opened its eyes, and so did every secret this family buried with it. Subscribe so the rest of this story doesn't slip away without you, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're watching from tonight. Wherever you are, I want to say hello and see just how far this story can travel. The gates of the Sterling estate opened without a sound, the way expensive things always do. Elias Thorne drove his rattling sedan up a drive meant for cars that cost more than houses, and felt every eye in the place land on him before he'd even parked. Lily pressed her nose to the window, her dark school uniform still crisp from the morning, her small hand curling around his sleeve as marble columns rose up ahead of them like the teeth of something enormous. Inside, the cold wasn't about temperature. It lived in the way the staff went still when he entered, in the flick of glances that measured his flannel, his work boots, the mud he'd never quite scrubbed off. A woman in a sharp navy suit, Vivian Sterling, Alistair's daughter-in-law, though she wore the title like armor, looked at him the way you'd look at a delivery left on the wrong doorstep. "You brought a child," she said, not quite a question. "I brought my daughter," Elias answered. The agency knew. Nobody had told the family that, apparently, or nobody had cared to. A maid in a stiff uniform stared at Lily as though she were a stain about to spread across the imported rugs. Elias set his jaw and squeezed his girl's hand. He'd swallowed pride at soup kitchens and bill collectors' desks. He could swallow it here too, in a house where the chandeliers alone could have paid off everything he owed. He was here for the paycheck. That was the whole of it. He kept telling himself that as they led him deeper into a fortress built to keep warmth out. They walked him past portraits of stern men and colder women, past rooms sealed like museum exhibits, and the whispering followed them the entire way. "That's the new one, the one off the street, won't last a fortnight." Elias had heard variations of that voice his whole life. He'd learned long ago it said more about the speaker than the spoken about. Still, when Vivian paused at a set of tall double doors and lowered her voice to something almost gentle, almost warning, he felt the first true prickle of unease crawl up his spine. "He doesn't respond," she said, "to anyone. Don't take it personally. And don't," she added, glancing at Lily, "let the girl upset him." The library swallowed sound the moment the doors closed behind him. It was a cathedral of a room, ceilings vaulting up 2 full stories, shelves of leather spines climbing higher than any ladder Elias could see. Light fell in long gold bars through curtains the color of storm clouds, and in the middle of all that hush sat a man in a wheelchair, facing the window, as still as the furniture around him. Alistair Sterling. Elias had expected something frail. What he found instead was a presence. Silver hair swept back like a lion's mane gone to snow, a thick white beard framing a face carved with the kind of lines you only earn. He wore a pale gray suit that probably cost more than Elias made in a season, but it hung on him like a costume, like something the family had dressed him in to keep up appearances. His eyes stared at nothing, his hands rested on the armrests, loose and forgotten, and it was the hands that stopped Elias cold. He crouched, slow, setting Lily gently behind him, and looked. Beneath the starched white cuff, across the back of that weathered hand, ink spread in intricate whorls, old tattoos, faded to soft blue-gray, the kind that didn't come from any parlor a billionaire would frequent. They were the marks of a rougher life. A harbor, a back alley, a war of some kind, fought long before the boardrooms and the balance sheets. This was not a man born into marble. This was a man who had clawed his way to it, and somewhere under the silence, that fighter was still in there. "You've got a whole story on you, don't you?" Elias murmured, more to himself than anyone. Behind him, Lily whispered, "Daddy, why is he so sad?" He didn't have an answer, but looking at those hands, the hands of a survivor, not a shell, something shifted in his chest. The family had brought him in to keep a monument dusted. He was starting to suspect they'd brought in the wrong man for that, because Elias had never in his life been able to walk past someone who was still fighting and pretend they weren't. He pulled a chair close, sat down at eye level, and got to work. Days folded into each other. Elias learned the rhythm of the house, when the staff changed shifts, when the board members arrived in their black cars for meetings held 2 floors below, when Vivian's heels clicked past the library door without ever pausing. And every day he sat with Alistair, and every day Alistair gave him nothing back. He talked anyway. He told the old man about the weather, about Lily's spelling tests, about the terrible coffee in the servants' kitchen that nobody would let him improve. He read aloud from the books on the shelves, guessing at which ones a man like this might have loved once. He wheeled him to the window and described the gardens. He tried music, tried silence, tried humor. Nothing reached him. Alistair's posture stayed rigid, his spine held at a stiff angle no comfortable man would ever choose, his eyes fixed on a horizon only he could see. The medical files called it catatonia, withdrawal, a mind that had simply left. Elias didn't buy it. He'd sat with grief before, his own wife, gone 3 winters now, and he knew the difference between a person who was absent and a person who was hiding. Alistair wasn't empty, he was locked. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. "You're in there," Elias said one gray afternoon, leaning close. "I know you are. I don't know what put you in that room and shut the door, but I know you're standing right behind it." The old man didn't blink. Lily started leaving him things, a dandelion from the garden, wilting on the armrest, a drawing of a lion, because she'd said his hair looked like one. She'd sit at his feet and hum to herself, unafraid in the way only children can be, and the staff would find excuses to hurry her away. Elias noticed how Vivian's eyes sharpened whenever the girl got too close, how the whole household seemed to hold its breath around any sign of life near the old man, as if warmth itself were a threat to something they were carefully protecting. He didn't understand it yet, but he was beginning to feel the shape of it, the way you feel a storm before the sky admits to it. It broke on a Thursday. Elias had wheeled Alistair into the main hall for what the family called his afternoon presentation, a grotesque ritual where the board members filed past on their way to their meeting and nodded at the old man like courtiers at a corpse, murmuring pleasantries no one expected an answer to. Elias hated it. Today he hated it more, because Vivian had made a point, loudly, of instructing a nurse to keep the child out of the family's sight, and Lily had heard, and Lily had cried. He stood at the edge of that cold marble room, his daughter's tears still drying on his shirt, and watched a dozen polished people talk over a living man as if he were furniture, discussing his health, his estate, his timeline, while the man himself sat rigid and silent and utterly alone in the center of them all. Something in Elias simply ran out. He crossed the floor. The murmurs stopped. Vivian said his name like a warning, and he ignored it. He dropped to one knee in front of the wheelchair, right there in front of all of them, level with those distant eyes, close enough to see his own reflection in them. "Listen to me," he said, low and rough. "I don't care about their money. I don't care about their meeting. I've watched them talk about you like you're already gone for 2 weeks, and I'm done watching it. You hear me? These people," his voice cracked, "they've given up on you. Every last one, and I'm not going to. But you have to give me something. Nothing. That awful, patient nothing." And so Elias leaned in until his forehead nearly touched the old man's, and from somewhere deep, from the part of him that had knelt at his wife's bedside and refused to let go quietly, he found the one word that felt like the whole of it, spoken in a language he didn't know he remembered. Basta. Enough. The word hung in the air like a struck bell. For one endless second, nothing moved. The board members stood frozen mid-step. Vivian's mouth had opened to object and stayed open, silent. Lily's small hand found Elias's shoulder from behind. And Alistair Sterling, the monument, the shell, the man who had not spoken in 4 years, moved. His hand came off the armrest. Slow at first, trembling, the tattooed fingers reaching through the gold-lit air like a man surfacing from deep water. Elias felt it close around his own hand and grip. Hard, harder than any frail old man should have been able to grip, the strength of that buried fighter surging up all at once. Those distant eyes snapped into focus, and for the first time they were seeing, wet and wide and burning with something that had been waiting 4 years to be let out. Shock, hope, and underneath it, sharp as a blade, fear. Behind Elias, someone screamed. A crystal glass shattered against the marble. He heard Vivian gasp, heard a board member stumble backward into a side table, heard the whole gilded room dissolve into panic, because the thing they had all quietly agreed was dead had just opened its eyes and taken hold of the one man who'd refused to let it stay buried. "There you are," Elias breathed, holding that grip like a lifeline. "There you are." Alistair's lips parted. His voice, when it came, was a rasp of rust and gravel, cracked from disuse. But the words were clear, and they were aimed straight at Elias, and they turned the temperature of the room to ice. "They're still here," the old man whispered. His eyes flicked, terrified, to the crowd of stunned faces. "You have to get her out, my granddaughter, before they finish it." Elias didn't understand. Not yet, but he understood the fear. And he understood, watching the board members' shock curdle into something colder and more calculating, that he had just walked his little girl into the middle of a war. They moved Alistair back to the library, and Elias made sure the doors were shut before he let himself breathe. The old man's grip hadn't loosened. His eyes tracked the room's corners like a soldier checking a tree line. "Start from the beginning," Elias said quietly. "Who are they? What did I just walk into?" It came out of Alistair in fragments, in that ruined whisper, each sentence costing him. He had built the company from a single freighter and a bad reputation. That was the ink on his hands, a life he'd never scrubbed off. But the empire had outgrown the man, and the men he'd trusted to run it had discovered that a silent founder is far more useful than a talking one. 4 years ago, he'd learned they were bleeding the company hollow. Offshore transfers, forged signatures, assets stripped and sold. When he'd threatened to expose them, they'd made it very clear what happened to old men who caused problems. "So I stopped," Alistair rasped. "I stopped being. I locked myself away where they couldn't reach the parts of me that mattered. A dead man can't sign what they wanted signed. A silent man can't be blamed for staying silent." His eyes found Elias's. It was the only prison they'd let me build, my own. "And your family?" Elias asked, though he already dreaded it. The old man's face folded. "My son died 2 years ago, a car accident." The words came wrapped in disbelief that had long since hardened into certainty. "Vivian runs his seat on the board now. She smiles at me over breakfast. She was in the room when they told me what would happen if I ever spoke again." His grip tightened. "And you, in front of all of them, brought me back to life." Elias sat with that, the enormity of it settling over him like the mansion's cold. He'd knelt down to save one lonely man. He'd instead lit a fuse. "Then we'll get you out," he said. "We'll go to the police, the press, whoever. They own half of both." Alistair almost smiled. "No, you don't understand what you've done, Elias Thorne. You didn't wake a patient." His eyes cleared, and for a moment, the fighter behind them stood at full height. "You woke a man who has spent 4 years memorizing exactly how to bury the people who buried him." The knock at the library door came within the hour. Vivian entered without waiting. 2 men in dark suits flanking her, her composure relacquered into place, but her eyes betrayed her, still bright with the panic of a woman whose comfortable arithmetic had just gone wrong. "Mr. Thorne," she smiled the way a knife smiles, "the family has decided your services are no longer required. You've clearly agitated my father-in-law. It's not healthy. For anyone." Her gaze slid to Lily, and lingered, and the threat in it was so quiet and so total that Elias felt his blood go cold. "You'll be paid through the month. Pack your things. Both of you." Elias rose slowly, putting himself between the men and his daughter. "He asked me to stay." "He can't ask for anything," Vivian said smoothly. "He's not well. Everyone in this house will confirm it." "I will confirm nothing of the sort." The voice cut across the room like a blade drawn from a scabbard. Every head turned. Alistair Sterling had straightened in his chair, and though his hands still trembled, his eyes were pure iron, and his ruined whisper carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had once commanded fleets. "This man stays," he said, "in my house, at my side, and Vivian," the name landed like a dropped stone, "you will not look at that child again, not once. Do you understand me? I have been quiet a long time. I have not been asleep. I remember every number, every account, every name." He let the silence stretch until she flinched. "Now get out of my library." For a heartbeat, Vivian's mask slipped entirely, and what showed underneath was not anger but calculation, the swift, cold math of someone realizing a plan had failed and a far more dangerous one was now required. She smoothed her jacket. She smiled again, thinner than before. "Of course," she said, "whatever you wish." And that, Elias understood as the doors clicked shut, was the most frightening thing she could have said, because she hadn't lost. She'd simply decided to stop being polite about winning. They came in the dark. Elias didn't sleep much in that house. Old habit, the light sleep of a man who'd spent years listening for a child's cough, and so he heard it before the alarms did. The low crunch of tires on gravel, with the headlights off, the soft click of a service door that should have been locked, the particular quiet of men who move for a living. He was up and moving before his mind had finished the thought, bare feet silent on cold marble, and he had Lily awake and bundled and pressed to his chest before the first floorboard groaned under a stranger's weight. "Daddy." "Shh. Game, remember?" Quiet as mice. His heart hammered. "We're going to see Mr. Sterling." The mansion had turned against its own people. The staff, he'd realized too late, answered to Vivian, and Vivian had sent the household to bed early and left certain doors unlatched. Now shapes moved through the gold-trimmed dark. 4 of them, maybe 5, professional and patient, converging on the one wing that mattered. They weren't here to search, they were here to finish what silence had interrupted, to get a signature by force or to make sure no signature would ever be needed. Elias reached the library corridor a breath ahead of them and slipped inside, bolting the heavy doors. Alistair was awake in his chair by the cold hearth, and he did not look surprised. "They came faster than I thought," the old man said. Vivian always was impatient. His eyes went to Lily, half hidden in her father's arms, and something ancient and pained crossed his face. "I'm sorry. I never wanted a child in this." Fists hit the doors, then a shoulder. The old wood shuddered. Elias set Lily down behind the great desk, crouched to her level, and made his voice as steady as a father's voice can be. "You stay here. You don't come out, no matter what you hear. Promise me." "Promise," she whispered, and the trust in it nearly broke him. Then the doors gave way, and the war he'd woken came pouring into the room. The first man through the door was big and quick, and expecting an old invalid and a caregiver in a bathrobe. He got Elias Thorne instead, and Elias, whatever else he was, had spent a hard life learning that a cornered father is the most dangerous animal there is. He drove his shoulder into the man's midsection and took him off his feet into a marble bust that shattered across the floor, and then it was chaos, close and brutal and loud. He fought the way he'd done everything, without style, without training, with nothing but the absolute refusal to let anyone past him to that desk. He took a blow that split his lip and gave back 2. He wedged himself in the study doorway so they could only come one at a time, and he made each one pay for the door. He was bleeding and outnumbered, and he did not move, because 10 feet behind him, his daughter was holding her breath, and there was no force in that gilded house, or any other that would get him to yield that ground. And behind him, Alistair Sterling found his voice. Not the whisper, the voice, the one that had built an empire from a single ship, the one 4 years of silence hadn't rusted so much as sharpened. He had wheeled himself to the desk, to the old landline the house's own security had forgotten to cut, and he was speaking into it fast and low and precise, reciting account numbers, routing codes, the names of federal contacts who owed him decades of favors, freezing assets and triggering fail-safes he'd spent 4 silent years constructing in the dark of his own mind. Every word stripped Vivian's people of a little more of the power they'd come to seize. He wasn't calling for help. He was ending them. Basta, the old man said into the phone, and to the room, and to 4 years of fear, and this time it wasn't a plea. It was a verdict. Sirens bloomed in the distance. The intruders heard them, heard their employer's empire collapsing in real time in that ruined commanding whisper, and their nerve broke all at once. They ran. Elias let them, sagging against the doorframe, and turned to find Lily's face peering up over the edge of the desk, wide-eyed and safe, and Alistair setting down the phone with the calm of a man who had just won a war he'd started losing 4 years ago. "It's done," the old man said. "It's finally done." The dust of the Sterling estate took weeks to settle, and when it did, the whole shape of it had changed. Vivian and the board members were gone, some to indictments, some simply vanished into the kind of legal oblivion that swallows people who steal from men more patient than they are. The offshore accounts were unwound, the forged deals reversed, the stripped assets clawed back into daylight by a founder who had, it turned out, forgotten nothing. Alistair Sterling walked back into his own boardroom on Elias's arm, slow, leaning on a cane now instead of trapped in that chair, and the men who had written him off learned, one by one, exactly how alive he was. But it was the quieter changes that mattered to Elias. The library stopped being a tomb. Lily filled it with her drawings and her humming and her dandelions, and the old man let her, and sometimes Elias would find the two of them at the great window, while Alistair told her stories of a young man and a single freighter and a life clawed out of nothing, the true story behind the ink on his hands, finally spoken aloud to someone who wanted to hear it. "I have to ask you something," Elias said one evening. "The lawyer who hired me, it wasn't the agency, was it? It was you." Alistair didn't deny it. "I'd been watching for a long time, for the right kind of man, not a doctor. I'd had doctors. I needed someone who knew how to protect the thing he loved, with nothing but his bare hands, and refused to stop." He looked at Lily, then at her father, a man who would kneel down to a stranger and refuse to let him go. "I couldn't reach my own heart anymore, Elias. I needed someone who still had one loud enough to reach it for me." He set up a trust for Lily's future that made Elias's hands shake when he saw the number. A home of their own, off the estate, in a quiet street with a real yard, and a standing invitation to a library that was no longer cold, in a house that had finally learned what its money had never been able to buy. Silence had ruled that place for 4 long years. It didn't anymore. Now it was full of a little girl's humming and an old lion's laugh, and the easy quiet of 2 men who had walked into the same dark room strangers and walked out of it something like family. One Italian word cracked open 4 years of silence and buried an empire's worth of secrets, and this was only where it began. If this story reached something in you, hit subscribe so the next chapter finds its way to you too, and drop a comment telling me which corner of the world you're reading from tonight. I read every single one, and I'd love to send a hello your way and see just how far these words have traveled to reach you.